Berkeley.edu is apparently a bit challenging. We had this problem with Ayla from Matnock from Berkeley before, but Courtenay Conrad is here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we also have Meredith Blank.
Hi, from University of Michigan.
Berkeley.edu is apparently a bit challenging.
Whoa, that's awkward. Okay, so why am I getting playback?
Courtenay Conrad is here.
Oh, I know why that's happening.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sorry about that. We also have Meredith Blank.
My fault. Okay, I've got it. Good God. All right, Sarah Croco.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Susan Hyde.
Hi there.
Jason Lyle.
Hi, everybody.
Jakana Thomas.
Good morning.
And then we've got a crew in Ann Arbor. All right, Courtenay, if you get us started.
Okay, sure. Emiliano, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I really enjoyed the paper, Emiliano. And I have a bunch of comments on the paper that I think, as discussant, I'll send you after we meet today, and some of them may come up in our general conversation. But I want to focus my initial comments on some questions I had about your concepts, and then how those concepts relate to your measures and your choices of instrumental variables more generally. So, as you point out, literature on the effect of protest type on protest success is ridden with endogeneity issues and potential admitted variable biases that make causal inference particularly difficult. So your paper is a really nice contribution to this literature and trying to take causal inference more seriously in the study of political violence. So you're substantively interested in the effect of protest violence on the likelihood of the state giving policy concessions. But one thing that I thought was missing from the paper was that I didn't see a conceptual definition of violence. And so what I did was imagine my own conceptual definition of violence, which is really not what you want readers to do. So when I think of violence in the political science literature, I think primarily of interactions between the government and its opposition. But when I got to the way that you measure violence, it doesn't seem like that's what you mean, because you measure violence with a binary indicator of property damage. So I don't know whether or not I should be focusing now on the fact that I think your measure is not a good match to your concept, or whether we have different conceptualizations of violence and your measure is actually a really good match to your conceptualization, because I just don't know what your conceptualization of violence actually is. So I think this is particularly something that's important to consider because you have this instrumental variable approach. So the conceptual definition of violence is going to be particularly important for you in being able to justify your instruments theoretically, which is something that I think you can improve on in this version of the paper. So let me be more specific about what I mean by that. You make an argument for why rainfall and heat and secondary school holidays are correlated with protest violence. And so I actually think I buy your argument for why secondary school holidays are a relevant instrument the best of all three. So on an aggregate level, more young people are on the streets when school's out, and young people are more prone to violence on average. But the relationship that you talk about between the weather variables and protest violence is less clear to me in this version of the paper. So you basically argue that people get cold in the rain, and so they want to conserve energy rather than engaging in this high caloric activity. So the high caloric activity, as I understand it, what you're talking about in the paper, is that it's violence. But it seems to me that the decision to protest at all requires energy and resources, even if that protest is nonviolent. So if that's the case, then rainfall seems to be a better instrument for protest size rather than protest violence. At least, again, this is contingent on the way that I'm conceptualizing violence. So, of course, protest size and protest violence might be correlated. But in general, I want to see a fuller theoretical justification of rainfall as an instrument for violence rather than just as an instrument for some aspect of protests that's not conceptually defined. So I had sort of a similar problem with heat. So you cite literature in social psychology here indicating that people are more likely to engage in violence as temperature increases. So this justification seems on better theoretical ground than the one for rain as an instrument for violence. But my concern here I got piqued, I think, when I looked at the figure that you show on page 16. So, and you mentioned this earlier in the paper, heat doesn't increase disorderly conduct monotonically, and as a result you use this measure coded 1 if the temperature is between 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So my first reaction to that was that that didn't strike me as particularly hot. So it's hard to pinpoint the real micro foundations for the relevance of the instrument. So I wondered if maybe just people are out and about more and therefore protesting more when the weather's nice, right? So people aren't staying home when it's between 60 and 75 degrees. And that as a result of increased protest size, again, we might see more violence on average, but you're actually capturing a good instrument for protest size, not protest violence in particular. So again, Will, I don't know how long discussants typically comment in this setting. So I have more comments on theory and measurement and empirical strategy, but I think I'll stop there for now and sort of throw things out as they come along. But again, Emilio, I really enjoyed the paper. I think it makes a real contribution in this hunt for causal inference in the literature on political violence. So thanks for letting us read it.
Okay, so we'll turn it over to Emiliano to respond and remind everybody that if you have at any time, you want to jump on a point that's being made, please just give me 2 fingers and I'll put you down in the queue. If you want to add a new point, 1 finger, and go ahead and I'll try to acknowledge by looking in the mic, in the camera, to let you know that that I've seen that. And you guys can start that at any time. Let me turn it over to Emiliano.
Okay, thank you very much for the comment, and thanks for the opportunity for this meeting today. Yeah, so can people hear me, I guess, first of all?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, I guess maybe the first point that you brought about the conceptualization of violence here. So I'm thinking of this as sort of classical bargaining type of story where there's some kind of threat being used to indicate either a seriousness or the strength of the protest. Protesters, as they try to get their demand, I guess probably if I had my way of, in terms of data collection, I would have had more ingrained measures of how much property destruction was going on, and then also more information about other kinds of violence as well. But taking a classic like rioting type of situation, sort of where you might understand a cost being incurred. Or a cost being levied on the state or the corporate actor who maybe protests as a way to indicate some kind of threat of what's going to happen if we don't get some sort of concession for what we want. And I guess rioting is sort of the instance that I'm talking about here, since it is this measure of whether there's property destruction attending the protest or not. And I agree. I don't know if this is exactly the point you're making, but that there's certainly, I guess, definitional grounds to complain about whether that's truly violence, and for some people that property destruction is a kind of violence and things like that. But I guess in this context, if really what I'm talking about is rioting and using property destruction as a way to potentially get what you want, basically, as a threat. And I guess in terms of the instrument relevance here, so I definitely take your concern about the instrument possibly also affecting size as well for these 2 weather variables. I think I mentioned in the paper there how when I do look to see if there's an effect on size from the rain variable, to my surprise, I'm not finding much of a difference or significant difference for protest size on the rainy versus non-rainy days. I think that so perhaps that would have been picked up here if there was some better data on time. I guess in terms of the inverse U that you mentioned for the temperature variable, it's important, I guess, to note maybe that there is, if you also use the just a basic linear measure of temperature, you see more or less the same result here. And I guess, as I mentioned in the paper, there's a sort of dispute in the social psych literature as to whether this relationship is inverse U or monotonically increasing. I think there's some camp arguing for why, I guess the inverse U would be moving to the microfoundations, and that is, as temperatures get especially hot, it makes people more lethargic rather than more aggressive. Up until a point, your aggression will increase, but temperatures get very hot, people get lethargic. I mean, I think the argument that's made. I think I have not actually checked to see about size's effect on, or about temperature effect on actual size. I did that with rainfall primarily, but that's something that we're also looking into. And I think for me, one of those parts, I feel like the rainfall and heat ones are a little more convincing to what I believe myself, actually, more so than the school holiday stuff. So it's interesting to hear that alternative perspective.
Okay, we've got Meredith on a two-finger.
Hi, yeah, no, I really enjoyed this paper, and I think that there's there's definitely the space for it. I think going back to the conceptualization of your version of political violence and rioting, I think you can make it a lot easier for yourself if you draw on some of the social literature that really provides sort of very solid definitions for why we should care about protests that turn violent, that turn into rioting, and how that connects with higher levels of political violence. So I don't know if you've considered sort of Jennifer Earle and Sarah Soul's work. Earle does sort of an overview piece called Tanks, Tear Gas, and Taxes, which if you haven't looked at already, you might, because it just sort of provides the basic theoretical frameworks for protest activity and repression. So that just might help clarify some of these terms you're working with and how they connect to this broader concepts of political violence that you're trying to get at.
Yeah, no, I know Soul's work. I'll listen to the Earl thing. So I guess I'm hearing maybe just better definition at the outset. Why we should think of rioting as connected on this continuum of political violence that can lead up to civil war and things like that. Is that sort of right?
Yeah, because when you sort of begin,
I'm seeing some nodding faces.
Yeah, when you're talking about introducing with like the primary Civil War literature, that's only like one part. That's only the extreme part of the spectrum that we really care about, and so you're getting at another part of the spectrum, but it's still all connected. And so I think just sort of clarifying that a little bit more in the beginning can help your readers.
Thanks.
Okay, Susan.
Yeah, I had I'll concur that I think this is a really, really interesting paper.
You're muted, Susan.
What?
I hear her.
I hear her too.
Your mic?
I can hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. Try again.
Okay.
It's me. I'm being an idiot.
Okay.
I was trying to manage feedback, and I was just being stupid. Sorry.
Okay. I'll just say that I agree that it's a really interesting paper. My main question has to do with what you identify with this set of instruments. And the main concern, if we're talking about the effectiveness of protest violence, and that's the sort of motivating question of interest, I'm a little, worried or thinking about the type of violence that you've identified with this instrument. So, if we sort of take it for granted that it does identify protest violence in a way that we would want an instrument to identify violence, I think it might still only identify the type of violence that is perpetuated by people who are frustrated because they're hot, who are bored because they're school children and have nothing else to do, or who, are, I think maybe the most likely one that's connected to what might be called the strategic use of violence in a protest, or the use of violence with the intention of achieving some sort of other goal, would be perhaps the rainfall, that people who were intending to use violence strategically are deterred from doing so because it's raining. And so I guess it's more of a conceptual point, and it leads, if I buy everything having to do with the instrument and some of the interpretation, then it does raise some questions, to me at least, about the interpretation of the finding, right? It's really the causal identity of people who are frustrated because they're hot turning violent on protest outcomes, and without linking to the particular objectives of particular protests, it sort of becomes less clear to me how I should interpret the overall findings. So I just wanted to raise that question, that it's maybe not it's a great advance in trying to have some sort of causal identification of the effect of violence, but it might end up being the causal identification of a specific type of violence that may be more or less likely to be successful.
Emiliano, we've got two fingers popped up. Do you want to respond now, or do you want to hear what other...
Yeah, maybe guys respond to that, sure. So yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and actually one thing that I'm working on for the next version of this is talking more about the local average treatment effects that we might think are relevant for the different instruments, and I do think there's probably at least a potentially different effect here going on with the holiday versus some of the weather stuff, where there's this compositional change that I'm hypothesizing with the school holiday instrument, and that you actually might have younger, more hoodlum-like, for lack of a better word, participants. So the composition of the protest might change, and I think that could actually affect the interpretation of the violence by the protest target. Am I seeing this as something that is a strategic element or not, or is it something that is sort of peripheral to the protest and not actually communicating the goals or the tactical decisions of the protesters. And I see that as less of the case with the weather instruments, which should be affecting everyone who's there. I guess the thought is it's sort of a universal biological effect. It's not only going to be affecting sort of younger people, but people get more irritable or more aggressive, or they get colder and don't want to engage in more energy-intensive acts. And so I do think there's it's correct that there's probably different effects going on here, and I think in the future I'm going to make sure I'm talking about a causal effect of violence rather than the causal effect. I think some places I use that instead, because probably different ways of violence is interpreted, and depending on who's doing it. And I guess one question about is how much any of that information, any of these differences are actually communicated to the protest target at all. I'm not sure to what extent, if you're the government or anything, there's been rioting on the streets, if you have a good understanding or not, whether this was, youth who were breaking in and doing stuff, or people setting stuff on fire, who are, older union members or what. So, maybe that may, or the difference may not be relevant in some cases, but probably in others there may be ways like a mayor, for instance, to know from the police what exactly transpired. But I think it's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Jace?
Actually, the answer got at most of what I wanted to raise. It's just I would really encourage you to chase after these local average treatment effects. Just because every time I kept reading it, I had the same sort of concern Susan did. I wasn't sure what the quantity of interest was telling me, or who it was applicable to. And so, I could imagine subsetting this by group. I could imagine subsetting it by target. I could imagine subsetting it by the demand that's being made. And then the other thing I thought was really important was whether this is the first time that the group's actually engaging in a protest or whether this is a more experienced group that's gone to the barricades multiple times. And I kept trying to slot through your different instruments for these different kinds of groups, and I think the channels work for some and work less well for others. And so, just to get at that strategic logic, a group that's been to the barricades multiple times is going to have a good sense of what its strategy is going to be, and it probably is more disciplined than a group that maybe is going out for the first time. And so I'd love to see you trying to unpack things like organizational age or organizational experience and really see what the effects are across these different groups.
Response? Or take the next one?
Yeah, I'll take the next one. Great. But yeah, that's well taken.
Okay, Courtenay? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just going to follow up and say that I think a lot of this discussion is about a worry that the instrument of rainfall, for example, affects the decision of some groups to engage in violence given that a protest is occurring. One thing that I think that you're missing is the fact that rainfall can also affect whether or not a protest occurs at all. Right? So there's two issues here. One is that rain can affect the decision to engage in violence given that a protest is happening, but it can also prevent a protest, whether violent or nonviolent, from occurring at all.
Yeah. So I do tend to see if there's a different number of protests on the rainy versus non-rainy days, and I don't find this a significant difference. Also, somewhat surprising to me. I guess when I think about the reasoning for that, I think part of it is that there's some core group of activists that's going to show up to the protest. They called it. They can't cancel it, especially in pre-social media age. It'd be very hard after putting the call out to tell everyone, communicate to anyone that we're not going to do it after all. So I think that's definitely a concern. I'm not seeing in the data a difference though in the number of protests that actually do occur on the rainy versus non-rainy days.
Okay, Jakana?
So I think this might be a 1.5 finger. It's related, but it's a little bit different. So my concern is that.
Sorry, my fault. This time I had you down.
You have me?
Yeah, sorry, I had the mic down.
Okay. So my concern is that specifically the weather-related instruments may not actually be exogenous regressors, which they would need to be. And I guess my concern is related to this discussion that people tend to observe the weather report, right? And they decide that they're not going to turn out if it rains. However, if they really value whatever it is, so they value whatever the good is, they're going to be more likely to turn out. But then that's related to the probability that they're going to get a concession in the first place. So if they don't really highly value what it is, then a lot of people might not turn out, and they are maybe more likely to get a concession because the government or whoever it is doesn't really care about what concessions they're making. But if it's a really, really important cause, people are going to turn out whether it's hot, people are going to turn out whether it's cold, and those are going to be the cases where it's way less likely that they're going to get concessions in the first place. And so I think in this case, if that's actually how it's working, we're not working through violence. This is the heat and the cold is actually impacting the probability of concessions without respect to violence. And then that would make it not really a good instrument. And so I don't know if that's actually the case, but that occurs to me. And I do work on concessions, and so I guess that's where I'm coming from, looking at how much harder it is to get a really important strategic concession than it is to get a not meaningful one. And then the ones that are really meaningful, people are going to fight harder for it, whether it's 100 degrees, 90 degrees, 60 degrees, whether it's raining or whether it's sleeting, people are going to come out regardless. So that's kind of what I was thinking about the instrument.
Okay, Emiliano, that was Jakana.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so I talked a little bit about that in the paper, and I think that's definitely a spirit of consideration that matters a lot here. I guess I think that in advance knowledge of the forecast is maybe something that may not have been so accurate in the past. It's been a little bit of looking into the reliability of meteorology reports back in the time period we're talking about in most of the 80s, and it seemed like there was a lot of inaccuracy. So, I think it's still a possibility that you're right that folks are still going to hear, there's a weather report like this, and that certainly seems like a threat to the identification assumptions here. But I guess I'm not sure if it's as strong a case as maybe it feels to us now. Maybe when we can look at real-time radar or something online. But I do think that's a concern I can't really I can't eliminate entirely. Yeah, and I guess the issue is also to what extent there's correlation though between violence and I guess these forecasts of weather and attendance too, right? So it's just that people aren't coming as much, which I'm not seeing in the data. I mean, rainy versus non-rainy days. Then that's not necessarily a threat in and of itself. There has to be some kind of correlation between the prediction of the rainfall and the tendency to use violence. And so I can see sort of strategically how definitely I'm going to show up more if it matters more, but the choice of the violent and non-violent dimensions of protest doesn't seem obvious to me that correlated there with that.
Okay, Jakana, you wanted to.
So I should first apologize. I couldn't hear the last part of what he said, so I may be like talking over what he just said. So I'm having a problem with the feedback with the phone. But I think mostly I guess this concern to me still persists whether or not the meteorological reports are consistent, because if people look outside the windows and think it's cold or it's going to be cloudy, that might still determine whether or not they come to a protest at all or whether they come out. Similarly, if people get out there and it's really cold or it's really cloudy, they may leave before anything actually happens. So I don't know that the report itself necessarily, or the lack of reliability of the report really alleviates that concern. But you may have said something to that effect and I just completely missed it, so I apologize if that's the case.
No, I was agreeing that the concern still persists. I think there's maybe a reason I think it's less persuasive maybe then than now, but yeah, I don't think that there's anything to acknowledge that. But then I think maybe the thing that I said at the end was other, the real threat to identification and what happen if we think there's some type of correlation between whether the tendency to be violent or not and this forecast of rain or not. So I guess that was the only second point that I was thinking about. But yeah, I think you're generally right. That's something that could be possible here.
Susan, is that a 2 or a 1?
I'm trying to do a 2.
Okay.
I just wanted to emphasize one other aspect of this point that I maybe said too quickly or something like that. That is, if we think about the broader theory of when protest violence might be likely to work, I guess, in say a labor strike or something like that, it might have to be strategically timed, right? That there's a logic about protests and the use of violence in protests that at least one can imagine, that I might not agree with, but that one can imagine that says that it's not just about getting violent at any point and that should have a causal effect on the protest outcome. It's about whether the violence comes in the point of a negotiation in a labor dispute that's related to some sort of crossing of a line or that's escalating the dispute in some way. And so I think that's sort of a different point. It's important to be clear that is outside the scope of this project, especially if you're counting a lot of strikes and whatnot within this. So it makes sense to me that the violence that's really motivated by people being frustrated because they're hot or something like that would be not particularly effective and might even lead the target of the protests to conclude that the protesters are not very well organized, they're not very well controlled, or something like that. But what I don't know that you can do with this instrument, and I think it's probably important to make clear, is really say this is the effect of strategically timed violence on policy concessions. And I wanted to just emphasize that's part of the point that I was trying to make earlier that I think I didn't make clear.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We have Sarah on a 1 finger.
Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly different direction and talk about this, I guess, from the point of view of someone who does, mainly just international conflict, so kind of conflict or violence at a much larger level. And so when I think of protests, I tend to think, like, what was going through my head here was like Occupy Wall Street and that kind of stuff. So what I thought was missing, and I agree with an earlier point that Courtenay made, that I needed to kind of have a visual picture of what you were thinking of a protest. And I thought that the paper could really benefit, even from just some short examples of these protests that are happening, and that could really add a lot of color to the paper, especially in the intro. Like in the intro, I feel like you just kind of jump right in to like what the problem is, and that's fine. I mean, I like papers that get to the point, but just illustrating a little bit for the reader as to, here's what a typical protest looks like in my data set. Here's what I mean by property damage. Like all the windows of the shops along the main street were broken and, mass looting, like those kind of things, to give me an image like, okay, is this more like the riots from Los Angeles? Is this more like, peaceful protests on a college campus? I just didn't know what you meant by protests. And then, but that kind of correlates with what you meant by violence, like, because you said that it's just, if the newspapers are reporting that violence was used, but I didn't know if that meant like one person, throws a rock through a window, or there was like, massive charges of people against, police. So that, I think the paper could really benefit from having some of those examples in there, just to give, and that would address some of the earlier comments, getting to how you're measuring your concept. And so I really did enjoy the paper, and this was a great opportunity for me to learn more about something that I don't normally read much about, and it was very well written. But I just thought it could benefit from just putting in some kind of real-life examples there. So another kind of a question related to measurement was, you talked about how it was coded if the newspapers mentioned concessions. And so obviously there's going to be variation in that variable if they either don't or do get concessions. But what came to my mind is that every time I have been to France, there have been protests or strikes of some kind going on. So much that I just thought this was just like an everyday occurrence there. So I'm wondering how often the newspapers are not reporting on protests that are happening, and if they're more likely to report on those that either have their demands met or those where their demands are denied. I could be totally off base in that context, in that maybe people really care about all these protests and so they do get covered. But I just wondered if there was some kind of censoring on that variable, because the newspapers are only likely to cover a protest if, in hindsight they saw, oh yeah, this one actually was effective. So I guess I'll stop there, but those were my two comments that came to mind as I was reading it.
Yeah, so I think that's something that I definitely want to do. The first point, add more detail about sort of typical or canonical types of protests we're talking about here. I mean, the one thing that a table should have been in there, and that will be, sort of goes through the issues, sort of descriptive stuff about what issues are typically in protests, and just so folks know, most of it is labor related, either unemployment or wage protests. But then there's I guess also some EU-wide protests that are somewhat common as well, about trade policy and things like that. A lot of the canonical violence that we're talking about here, in a labor context, come from some pretty militant trade unions. And I think I could give maybe one very brief example in there about, there's I think truckers shutting down roads, I think for foreign imports or something, and breaking things up along the highway or things like that. So that there is, I think the smashing some windows is common, but one thing that in the data set as it is currently that I don't have a good sense of, whether this was one person breaking one window or whether there's a lot of people breaking lots of windows. That's limitations violence here, it's very infrequent, and when you include that in the impressions, it doesn't have any different effect on its own than the property destruction. But yeah, no, that's definitely worth including more sort of examples of what we're talking about here, and to do that. So thanks for the comment. And then I guess in terms of measurement, yeah, I think for my sense is that you're probably right. Something that there was a win, more likely to be reported. Also, I think there's some existing literature that talks about what types of are more likely to be reported or not, whether violence or violent events are more likely to be reported. But I think there's some disagree about some other characteristics of protests that results are more or less likely on the basis of some other elements. And I guess I don't really, I guess in the French context, I don't have a good sense of locally in the national context whether there's any variation on those existing results. We're going to look into this.
Okay. We've got Courtenay and Jakana on 2 fingers.
I think mine was a 2-finger on the first part of Sarah's comment, not on the second. So I think comment is generally more about framing the paper. And so when I was reading the paper, I kept thinking that IV approaches aren't new, and your instruments aren't new, with the exception of school holidays. So what I felt like was missing from the paper was a justification situated in the literature with a theory about why this was interesting about political violence. So there was a lot of discussion about the instruments to justify the instruments, but sometimes I think in papers with instrumental variable approaches that's taken too far, such that you sort of miss stating what's cool about the actual endeavor, right? And the real endeavor is to try to look at the effect of political violence on the likelihood of concessions. And you have an interesting empirical result, right, that we see this negative correlation between violence and concessions. And that gets lost for me in the discussion as the paper's currently written. And so I think some of the comments, like my starting off the discussion with comments on the fact that I thought there was a mismatch between some of your concepts and measures and that affected your choices of instruments, I think speaks to the fact that it gets, the real contribution of the paper, I think, gets lost partially in the discussion of the instrumental variable approach, partially in the discussion justifying the instruments. And that's not the real substantively interesting part of the paper. And so I think, Meredith's comments about situating this in the literature and sociology on protest movements is really interesting, right? So you cite some of this literature, but the extent you go so far as to say that there are these, very different results that are found in the literature, and perhaps it's because of this endogeneity problem. So I think I just, from a framing standpoint, want to push you further to not have this be a paper that's just about, hey, I have a cool instrument, because it is in fact an instrument that people have already used in different areas of political violence.
Okay, we've got Jakana, Sarah, and Meredith on 2 fingers. Emiliano, do you want to respond or keep going?
Sure, real briefly. Yeah, no, so I think that point's well taken. Yeah, and certainly to a certain extent, the framing, it's bringing up it is really identification heavy, and I should get more into the substantive concerns, perhaps at the beginning more than I do. And I guess, maybe, to my knowledge, I guess I'm not much sure where the instrument's been used in this particular type of context with instrumenting for violence in this way. But, I do think you're right that, brain has been used a lot in other related contexts, and so I think it's worth taking your point to heart and including more substantive discussion of the end. Thanks.
Okay. Jakana.
I actually have a 2-finger on both of the comments that were made. So the first one, I'll go with the second one first, or the first one first. So I think that you can do a little bit or a lot to reframe the paper, especially you talk about a lot of the literature on civil war and terrorism and political violence, but I think there's a literature that you could directly situate your stuff in, and that's the stuff by Chenoweth and Steffen, but also by Kathleen Cunningham, and there was a special issue in JPR that looked at nonviolence versus violence broadly and how effective it is. So I would suggest that you look at the special issue in JPR and maybe try to situate your paper a little bit more in this literature that looks at how nonviolent movements may be a little bit more effective than violent protests. Because I think it fits there. The second point that I wanted to make is related to coding. So you mentioned that you drop protests where demands are not clear. So when you can't identify what demands the group wants, you drop those protests. But my concern is, what if the identification of those demands is really made by whether that group got a concession or not? So if the coders were looking through the newspapers and when the government made a concession, they were like, oh, okay, so they got a concession for X. This is what their demands obviously were. And so I was wondering how you think this might bias your results, and then what there is that you can do about it. Is there some other data that you could rely on to identify some of these demands, or whether you felt like it was something that you could do to recode some of these cases where the demands were not certain?
Okay, so in terms of the last point, there's not very many actually observations that are dropped on the basis of not having an issue. So I think, if I remember correctly, like 60 or 70 out of 1,000.
So clarify that. That was a note. Clarify that, because that was a note that I had as well.
Okay, definitely we'll do that. And I guess I should probably clarify how even when I ran it before by grouping by target and protester, but obviously not by issue in that case because there was no issue coded. Results aren't significantly different. So I don't think that's something that's really biasing stuff here, although if it's a priori, you might think it would be. I know the Chenoweth and Steffen stuff well, and yeah, I guess there's this difference that they're focused on large-scale civil conflicts like wars and separation, and the separatist movements and anti-occupation movements. I wanted maybe if you could mention, I think you referenced something right after Chenoweth and Steffen that I didn't quite hear.
It was a special issue that's been published.
Yeah, no, I heard that, but I think wasn't there something in between those two?
Kathleen Cunningham. So it's in that special issue. She did some work in that special issue on that.
Who was it?
Oh, okay.
Kathleen Cunningham.
Cunningham.
Okay, no, so I don't. So I'll look into that more. Yeah, and so I guess maybe there's this tension here in terms of framing it within the more sociological or political science lit this focus on riots and stuff like that, more so than civil war. And am I hearing for you that the more local, the smaller level violence that should be played up more? Is that right? Because I do spend a lot of citation on more of the Civil War literature.
Right. Yeah, and you actually do a good job in the lit review. Actually, one of the things that I liked about it and was surprised because you're an economist was you frankly do a better job being familiar with a broad scope of literature over decades than most political scientists do, particularly those who write on Civil War. But that said, I think you are getting the feedback that you are actually talking about protest, and that is something that the Civil War literature tends to give short shrift. It's where there's been a lot of attention in the last decade, but there is more work that I think that balance toward talking about those works that address the process that you're really looking at makes more sense. I think that's broadly what folks are saying. Sarah?
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback on what Jakana said, I really like her idea of tying it back to that broader literature, because what I found as I was reading it, like once I hit page 26 and like basically through 29, I felt like I kind of like did a double take and I had to go back and read the transition, be like, wait, why is he all of a sudden talking about individual protester motivations and characteristics about individuals who are in the protests and this emotional versus, and so it just seemed to be like this real disconnect between your findings and then when you're talking about the implications of the findings. And I was trying to formulate a comment along those lines, but then I was like, wait a second, no, he actually is talking about what matters here, you know, and talking about why are protesters actually still doing this if they don't get anything out of it. But I felt like that, because the paper focuses so much on like, wow, these, you know, IVs are so good at, you know, actually teasing out the real effect, that kind of got lost. And so, and you also don't talk about individual attributes of the protesters very much in the paper. So, like, the whole back part of it, like I said, the 26 through 29, I think if you could take some of that out and make it more about these larger types of violence and what people have found, you know, and framing it as Jakana suggested, I think that would be a lot better. It just seemed there, like I said, it was just a disconnect in that back part that made me think, like, wait a second, did I miss something in the paper? You know, why is he all of a sudden now talking about, you know, the individual and emotional kind of motivations that these protesters might have? And so I didn't think that really added, I mean, even though, like I said, I stopped myself and I was like, wait a second, no, that actually is answering the puzzle. But it's just, I felt like the paper didn't really have, the findings didn't really speak to that kind of stuff as directly as they could speak to these other literatures that have looked at the effectiveness of violence on different scales. So I really like Jakana's suggestion. I think that's a good one.
Yeah, can I just clarify something? So you're saying that you think 26, 29 are addressing substance stuff, but to take it out, or so I'm not clear, you want it out, or you want me to maybe expand on that earlier in the paper to?
I think you could do, there's two paths you can take. So if you go the way the paper I think would be strongest is if you tied it to, if you took out this like individual, like I'm looking at my other screen here, where you're talking about like opportunistic and ideological joiners and like all these things that apply at the individual level to particular protesters. None of that is mentioned in the paper, nor can you capture that with the variables that you have. So I think the better, I mean, all that is right, I'm sure. But I think the way that the paper is framed is more about, you're trying to say, here's how we're actually able to isolate the true causal effect of violence on protest success. That fits into a whole broad literature, like the ones that Jakana was mentioning, right, that talks about when violence actually gets the government to give concessions to groups. So I think that might be, I would frame it around that. So even though I think that 26 through 29 are correct, I just felt like they were part of a different paper, and that the paper would be stronger if you made it more about, let's see when this particular strategy works, not why do particular individuals participate in this strategy, you know, if it doesn't work. I guess that's how I would maybe reframe it. And I'm happy to be overruled or ignored here. That's totally fine. That was just, I noticed when I was reading the paper, there felt like a disconnect there because all of a sudden we were learning about what individuals thought as they were kind of on their way to the protest. And that just seems maybe a bit out of place to me. But again, I'm not, I don't work in this literature often, so I could be totally off base.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess, I am working on something else that's more of a formal game theoretic model, trying to explain the decision between political violence in this context. But so, I mean, I definitely feel like maybe there's a reason to separate that into the paper. But I guess I included that because I want to try and give some explanation for why what seems to me like has been a somewhat counterintuitive result, or at least contrary to much of the existing work on such violence. Like, what might be explaining it, and maybe it's perhaps sort of this micro level bias I have given the training I've had makes me want to go to the individual level. But yeah, I mean, I'd be interested if others also maybe think that should be removed, or my take, I guess, is maybe more to expand on that with, and like as I mentioned, more formal modeling at the individual level primarily.
Well, can we take a quick poll for those who have an opinion about whether dial that down on the back end or dial it up on the front end? Anybody have an opinion? Do I see one in Ann Arbor? Go ahead and jump in if you do.
Yeah, my only concern, I would actually say maybe dial it back a little bit, only because the focus the paper release is structured now is sort of the use of these environmental effects on aggregate violence levels, and I'm not sure if it fits as cleanly with the logic of the paper overall. And it seems like space that could be better used maybe for other explanations related to what's in the paper already. I'm not sure if putting it to the front and trying to push it would do anything more than maybe confuse the focus of the paper before people even get to the better strong part.
Okay. Others?
I can maybe chime in. Is that okay?
Please.
So I couldn't tell if there's a line still or not, but I guess I would focus on whether part of it is that I'm still struggling with what exactly is measured in the protest data, and whether I think that the violence that's associated with the protests that's identified by this instrument is in fact political violence. I think it might not be what I think of when I think of political violence. I think when I think of the sort of riots, those could, or it could be entirely non-political, I guess, in a way. Maybe those are dropped because they don't have a clear objective, but when I think of labor strikes, which I think are included, you know, I don't usually consider those political, right? I mean, I feel like government or a political party is often involved in political violence or the possibility of civil war. And so in terms of this framing question, I don't have an answer because I'm stuck in the place that I just described, right? Is this really political violence, or is this some other kind of violence, or is it some combination of political violence and other forms of violence that's really being measured in this paper?
But in France, these strikes are political, right, Emiliano?
Yeah, in general, there's political backing, and the unions are incredibly politicized. Yeah, and I guess I'm drawing on some of the political science literature that sort of treats the bargaining, and also in economics as well. Sort of this is bargaining over wages, and often with the government as a target, even with a lot of state unions or state employees.
So that's good for France. Might not be true everywhere else, but the point remains that, I mean, just repeating my earlier point, the violent part of this, and you mentioned anarchists in the paper as a possibility of like a field experimental thing. I just think that's a different type of violence than the strategic use of political violence to achieve specific bargaining aims. And that's what I don't. That's where I'm stuck in terms of how to frame it.
Jakana?
I think I agree. That was one of the problems that I had when I was initially reading the paper, that I didn't think that all of the protests necessarily were political in nature, and I didn't think the violence associated with it was political violence. And I also don't think your explanation for why people engage in violence is related to it being political. And I guess that, to me, that seems like a mismatch between the literature you want to situate your paper in and what you're actually interested in measuring. Because especially on the violence end, you want to talk about political violence. So that's, general political protest and civil wars and terrorism, but which you talk about quite a bit throughout that. But then the violence that comes out of this is just, some hooligans fighting or breaking windows at a protest, which is really, really different. And so I think maybe to me it just requires you to be upfront about what you're talking about and why what you're measuring is that what you're framing it in. And I have another point which I've seemed to forget, so I'll give myself a two-finger if I remember it. But okay.
Okay, I actually have you in the queue, and if I could jump in here, Emiliano, you're an economist, and I'm assuming that you're going to plan to submit this to an economics journal, but that may not be true, and so. Realize you are getting a whole bunch of political scientists, and I have a somewhat different reading than a lot of these folks, and I know, for instance, if Bert Clandemans were here, a variety of the sociologists who study protest in Europe, they would be a little puzzled by some of these the recent comments, and so keep in mind that and so the message you're getting is there's a whole group of people who are very interested in your paper who are finding the framing difficult. And I'm sure if this was actually Charles Tilley's actual seminar where you would primarily have sociologists, you'd be getting similar sorts of comments but from a somewhat different take. And yet I'm sure you presented this to a whole bunch of economists where you haven't gotten these sorts of remarks. And so, one of the things for you to think about is, just generically, we all have this problem when we're trying to write, is who the hell's our audience? What can I assume they already know? And how do I pitch it, therefore? So be keeping in mind, if you're thinking, well, I don't know, it'd be nice to get this published in AJPS or JCR or whatever, then these are going to be much more important comments to keep in mind. I mean, you want to keep them in mind because you want as broad an audience no matter what. Well, I don't know. I'm going to leave it there because I think that's more or less what I had. Meredith?
No. So I want to kind of go back to, and I think that, regardless of how this paper ends up getting framed, there's a lot of benefits to the data you collected, and that there's some low-hanging fruit you could kind of highlight more. The fact is that, the protest data, at least that political scientists we tend to use that are cross-national time series, is really bad. Whether or not you've poked around in GDELT or Banks, there's lots of problems with the protest riot data that people are using. And so I think that, at some point could be discussed, because here you have, you're using data set that is relatively less problematic. The other thing is that regardless of whether it is strategic or non-strategic violence, I think that people are examining, there aren't that many uses of IVs or even really attempting to control for unidentified heterogeneity or these omitted variable biases in these models. So if you do look at kind of what Kathleen Cunningham has done, what Erica Chenoweth did in their model, they're using MLE, not OLS, they're just more generally using, MLE, logits, multinomial logits, but they're all sort of, one step, like pretty simple equations, and you're really trying to explore more of that, omitted variable bias, that type of thing, a little bit more explicitly. And so I think you could really highlight that more. We know that under with MLE, omitted variable bias can lead to inconsistent results, and we don't even know in what direction. So I think it's commendable that you're trying to resolve or address this issue, and it's actually what I saw was some of the more low-hanging fruit in the paper that could be exploited more.
Okay.
That's helpful. I guess I felt like I was pushing that. Maybe you could indicate where you're thinking maybe I would push up more in the introduction, or how it is what you're visioning that would actually frame it even more so like that.
I guess I would, tie it in sort of in the lit review, kind of highlighting what this paper's contributions are, because when you first started introducing some of the Civil War lit, I was assuming you wanted this to be framed more within political violence broadly, and it turns out that sort of the way we measure, the way we collect data on that and the way we measure it has all of these known problems. And so I just thought that was a place that you could be, pretty explicit about it. Even if you were to...
That's a good point. So in terms of the sort of micro-foundation analysis, I guess I'm wondering what the second point is. So I mentioned the Chenoweth stuff on page 9 and stuff. I guess, I definitely haven't cited Cunningham. You feel like I should be more more time in that lit review, distinguishing the I guess inability of existing lit to adequately address identification issues. Is that sort of what I'm hearing, or?
Yeah, and I guess it depends, like, what the way this paper is framed. I was initially reading it as if it was going to be framed for, like, for a Cunningham or for an Erica Chenoweth, where there are these issues of omitted variable bias, endogeneity in the data that is not really well explored. And I thought you did a really good job of sort of outlining why, we need to be concerned with these issues. And it just seems like also the data set you're using and the approach you're trying to use could address some of that explicitly. At least in the political science realm, where I know I work with banks a lot, and I know it's hugely problematic. So.
Jason.
I just had a quick question that's not about framing, but more about the theory that you're putting forward. I mean, if you want to engage the Civil War crowd, I mean, one of the things we're all kind of primed to think of is strategic interaction between at least two actors. And here it sort of takes place where you've got the protesters and the government, which is sort of happening off-site. But the big interaction that I thought was missing was really the protesters and the police and what that dynamic is on the ground. And in particular, if you're trying to figure out if violence is a strategic response to something, I mean, I kept thinking, well, what are the police doing in this story? Are they similarly affected by your instruments, by the weather, and things like that? And so I'd really like to hear a story. I mean, I don't know much about French police, but I imagine that they're part of this story. And I wonder if part of the violence just isn't induced by what the police are doing and what their tactics are and things like that. So I think that's, to me, is the key strategic interaction, not the protest or the government side. So I think that needs to be, at least, if you're not going to engage it, it needs to be at least explain why that's not here, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there's sort of this presumption in the paper that, this violence is, if not initiated, is being attributed at least to protesters, and I guess thinking there is, while the police may engage in repressive acts against protesters, usually it would be the protesters who would be engaged in the property destruction. I've had a limited amount of experience with certain French protests while being there and sort of observing them. I don't know if it's really enough to make a comparison to the more voluminous experience I've had in the U.S., but it does seem certainly like there is a first mover, I guess, norm for the protesters there in terms of who's initiating a conflict in France, more so than even in the U.S. And I think there is some, cultural, respect for protest there, and more of a tendency for the police to back off initially. I guess in this data, I really, I wish I had more detail about who was, if there was a way to say, who threw the first blow or things like that, that would be ideal. I'm trying to think what I could actually do in terms of the strategic interaction between protesters and police with this data set.
One thing you could do is look at Francisco's work, because that's explicitly what he studies with the Locke-Volterra, predator-prey models.
He does, and
you can look at France compared.
The tough is the timing. All this data is also day-based.
Right.
And so, there's not usually in the record most newspaper reports. Somebody who's seen on the front line. It was books smashing up the store that started this, or it was police, attacking protesters that started this. And so that's I guess the difference. My inclination is get more micro level data to see that kind of interaction. I do have info in his data set from whether police injured and whether protesters were injured, or reports on whether they were injured or not. So that's something I could think about maybe as a way to use apart some type of strategic interaction, maybe excluding some of the observations in which one side's injured but not the other.
What I was more thinking is you could write those reaction coefficients, give you some sense, because he estimates them individually by country, right? So you could look at that reaction coefficient in France compared to others, and you've actually got an estimate of the responsiveness, admittedly at the day level, like you're saying. Christian and I put out, we put a bunch of undergraduates in a protest in Chicago in an attempt to get at these micro-foundational responses. And it is a strategic, and we haven't, neither one of us gets organized enough at the beginning of a semester to mobilize some undergraduates to code the video yet. So I think we're 2 years into not doing anything with it. But it's that's just moving the unit of observation temporally just way down, and we all love to do that. But keeping in mind what is it that you've got set for the paper. I think Susan put it nicely. Keep in mind your scope conditions for this individual paper, right?
Yeah, right.
Alton, and then I've got Courtenay. I think now I've got you.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Shouting at the screen when it's muted doesn't work. So my first point builds off of Jason's previous point, and I think it's. I thought I had a solution, but then it went away. So my main concern also involves what the strategic interaction is here. So thinking about the way the instruments work, given the justification for the weather's effect on protesters, I'm not necessarily convinced that there's not also a similar effect on police. And when we think about when concessions are given, it's usually because methods for suppressing dissent are ineffective. So at least with respect to the weather instruments, I don't know if this is an additional section on the exclusion restriction, but I need to be more convinced about why weather isn't also affecting concessions through the efficacy of counter-protest forces, whatever they are. That said, I think that your school holidays instrument may be less problematic in that aspect. So I don't know. But if this paper is going to continue to be focused on sort of identifying a causal relationship and putting instrumental variables regression forward the sort of solution to the problem, that's the first of two concerns I have with this paper is that exclusion restriction with respect to response by the government. The other problem I think I identified, but again I'm not so clear on, is the SUFA restriction. So I can think about why the treatment of one protest may affect the likelihood of a concession in another protest if the protests are on related issues. So I know it was a while back that we talked about trying to calculate treatment effects, and I suspect that at least with respect to related protests, and I don't know if there's data on whether the protests are related or not, you're going to see some spillover effects between protests on the same issue. So if it's student protests on tuition, different concessions will be affected by the treatment in other protests, at least as far as I understand it. So if I could encourage you, I discouraged you before from spending additional space on some aspects of within protest dynamics. If you could save that space and instead use it to try and clarify the exclusion restriction with respect to the dependent variable, I don't know if that might be a more effective use of your time. If what you want to keep doing is make this strong causal claim, I mean, maybe you've changed your direction in the time that we've spoken, but that's the whole piece.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. So related to the second point, so I'm answering to that concern. I do try to cluster based on my scenarios based on whether there's the same protest target. I also try a different way of clustering based on whether same match of protester and target. Basically, for the reason that you mentioned, concern that there may be some kind of sequential effect. I conceded last week, it may affect my decision to concede to another protest this week. I think on terms of the first point, I think maybe there's a difference in terms of how the authority, if it's the government, they might respond in terms of the concession decision versus the policing decision, usually they're de-linked in most of these cases, and that there's like somebody on the ground in the moment making decisions about how to police versus a different party making a decision about whether to address the substantive concern of, maybe increasing the wage or, laying off your people or things like that. And so I sort of think that even if, and it seems likely that the weather instruments are affecting the police on, who are serving that day, I don't see that as necessarily a challenge of exclusion restriction here, and that the people making the decision on whether to give in or not are not going to be presumably effective. But that one thing I'm toying with, and I'm not exactly sure how to implement it, is by trying to look at a subset of protests where the decision maker is geographically distant from where the protest is happening, to see if maybe weather might be affecting the moods of the people making the decision on the substantive issue. It's a little hard to know exactly where that decision is being made in a lot of cases. But I guess another thing related to the first point is that even if indeed the weather conditions are affecting the police here as well, a lot of this sort of shifts maybe how the interpretation of the violence is read here. Is it protesters initiating violence that we're talking about, or is it whether the protests are violent at all, and who gets sort of the blame for that? I guess in the U.S. context, certainly in my experience, just most of the time it's attributed to the protesters in the absence of video of police abuse or something like that. And I guess in this case, France, I think there's maybe less of a tendency to do that. But still, I guess the question might be sort of just reframed: is it whether violence broke out at all, rather than whether it was the protesters who initiated it or not.
Okay, we've got Courtenay.
So I actually think mine ends up being a two-finger on Alton's, so I think that works well. So I agree with Alton's concern about repression and the fact that police actions have some implications for whether or not you actually have a valid instrument. But I also think that increasingly the paper is about concessions. And so there have been two sort of divergent literatures in my mind, one on state repression and one on state concessions. And increasingly we're seeing people take into consideration that these two, policy tactics, if you will, are related, and the governments can trade off between them, and that they might be substitutable, or they might be complements or whatever. And so I think that taking into consideration the strategic interaction between the police and the protesters is not just important for the instrument, it's also important for the larger endeavor, which again is to explain the effect of violence on concessions. And if we want to explain concessions, then we can't ignore this other policy that the government has that's also related to the decision to give concessions. So I just want to encourage you to take into consideration the strategic interaction for the good of your instrument, but also to take into consideration the strategic interaction for the good of the larger, project whose goal is to explain concessions by the government.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good point.
Okay. Well, the queue is empty. I've got a couple of comments. Let me just I'll throw out one of them. If you do decide that you want to try to pursue some of these local average treatment effects, subsetting, one thing you might look at is there's an interesting article in Proceedings National Academy of Sciences by David Layton and some colleagues that looking at wage discrimination against Muslims in France, and I'm wondering if your data would permit, or if given that wage competition is such a and public protest and strikes are such a big part of that, it would be interesting if it would be possible to show that that tactic really does not work well for certain sectors of the population. And I don't, that's asking an awful lot of your data, and I don't know that it would be feasible, and it certainly wouldn't be this paper, right? It would be some future paper. But I wanted to throw that out there. And one other last thing, and then we'll put a wrap on this. Something that you just step aside, but I think it came up in some of the discussion, I think probably mostly by Jakana, if I remember correctly, but I may not, is that, protesting itself is not a random treatment, right? So it's presumably tied to success, to at least an expectation of success. And so at some point, should we also be concerned, and again, this would not be something that I think you would probably want to address in the paper, but perhaps raise as a future direction, because I do think you've taken a step forward. I don't think we want to expect all papers to solve all or any one paper to solve all problems, but thinking about how we might model, whether a protest takes place in the first place is an issue that a lot of people have raised with respect to, Stefan and Chenoweth.
Mm-hmm.
So, Emiliano, can I ask you if there's anything in closing you want to throw out to the group, since you've got some of us here who've taken a chance to read it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for the helpful comments. And I guess, I am considering a couple of possibilities for next steps in future papers, and I guess I'd be interested maybe to hear what this audience feels would be most, interesting. So one thing would be sort of extending the existing type of analysis using the same instrument as some of the other state data that exists in the European protest and coercion data set. So looking at other states, or nation states. I guess another possibility would be trying to actually get this some richer outcome measures for other countries. So that's I think the chief limitation here, where I'm not seeing any other data sets that have a sense of whether there was success or not from the protest. And so there could be a string of research that I'm considering, just looking at some existing protest data sets, but just trying to now go back and actually get outcome measures. I think there's interest there in
I think
beyond Europe, so that there can actually be comparisons across developing countries, or also across forms of regime type. So there's two things at least related to this. I'd be interested to hear. Do you think that's worth pursuing or not?
Okay, let me open that up for reactions. Extending to additional countries, trying to code data on outcomes.
If I had to pick between the two, I'd go with the second one, just because I think that's more of a contribution in that you're actually creating something that scholars could then use in other areas, whereas the other one is just saying, okay, this is how it works in France. How does it work in other countries? And I'm sure people who are interested in those particular other countries would be interested in that, but I think just the second choice that you laid out would be better, because especially if you're already in the data to do some recoding, you can kind of take what we've been talking about here and make those outcome codings even more refined than what you have in this current paper, because once you're already, as I say, in the books, digging through stuff, you have the opportunity to create even better variables. So that's why I would encourage the second over the first.
Others? I think we're getting a bunch of people who are a little burned out.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you guys who took the time to read it and comment this morning and bump along with our technical challenges, which we continue to seem to encounter. Please do. Right, Christian and I created the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop to try and create opportunities to build community, particularly among PhD students and untenured assistant professors. And so we want to, leverage this, the existence of this technology to let us interact and communicate. We'll be doing our next call for papers in August, and so please try to make people aware. We'll probably have somewhere between 6 and 8 sessions in the fall, and for our spring call, we got a total of 6 proposals. So, not that we're dying to reject people, but it would be nice to actually get 20 or so proposals. So please consider submitting your own work, telling other people about it. And let me, again, just close by saying thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Very much appreciate the public comments.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, all.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.